The Abencerraje is one of a few notable anonymously published works in Spain in the 15th century. Notable because, well, when you publish something anonymously, you're looking to perhaps not get credit, sure, but artists tend to like credit. More likely, they're looking to avoid blame. And when you're dealing with the Siglo de Oro, in the 15th century was a very strong hand of government going on from the Catholic monarchs. That once they, and everything that followed, once they decreed, especially that all Jews were to be either converted or forced out, all Muslims were to be converted and forced out. They instituted some very strict social rules that became dicey for certain people, and that sense of an absolutist government essentially does not invite social criticism of any way, shape, or form. And so the Abencerraje is seeking to evade blame or any notoriety that would lead back to criticism of the criticism. So this story gets told. It is set in Spain before the expulsion, before back in the 15th or in the 16th, or no, back in the 1400s, and they it is a time of Muslims and Christians essentially coexisting peacefully, and the story itself is a not unfamiliar medieval tale, a lay, if you will, where it is about knights in shining armor. Essentially, it is a chivalric. It is in a way a love letter to the past, to a notion of chivalry, to a notion of honor and valor, and all of these attributes that we think of when we consider what the knight is supposed to be, the noble knight. So in that way, it is very conservative in the way that it is saying that these are the values that we should strive for in society. But what the Abencerraje does, very interestingly, is it takes that basic outline of a story, the story of courtly love and knightly chivalry and valor and all of that stuff, wraps it all up in a story where there are in fact two knights who exemplify these characteristics, and one is a Morasco, a Muslim, and the other is a Christian, and a Christian from a Catholic of some historical validity. He was an actual human being. And it sets up this story in very familiar knights in shining armor terms, where this great knight goes on a quest or a journey with some of his entourage, and they have a fairly familiar series of quasi-allegorical moments where these anonymous knights of his come and join him, and then they get to a fork in the road and they have to split, and you go that way and we'll go this way, and all this seems very reminiscent of a Chrétien de Troyes. And the one party of 5 knights, including the hero, the hero knight, Christian knight, they come across the Moor, and the Moor they challenge him because that's what you're supposed to do. There's no real reason for the Christians' entourage to be out there. They just sort of come up with the idea that, well, we have to go out because that's what knights do. It's kind of you don't look to it for details and motivation and stuff like that. But they come across the Moor and they challenge him, and one by one he knocks down all of the assistant knights, all of the henchmen, if you will, and he seems to make fairly quick work of them. And the what's it, Narvaez? I'm bad with names. Narvaez, the hero knight, sees this happening and says, "Okay, somebody hold my beer. I'm up." And he says, "I want a piece of this guy." So he goes, and they fight, and it is a very close battle. And when it is over, the Moor is injured, somewhat seriously, and but he has fought so bravely and so valiantly because he kept getting knocked down, but he kept fighting on, despite like a grievous arm wound, and you get the sense that he was really pretty banged up bad. But he so impressed the Christian counterpart that they strike up a friendship. On strictly knightly terms, they can recognize one another as sort of equals, parallels. And so they strike up a friendship. And it turns out that the Moor is on his way to go find the love of his life. And when he tells this story to the Christian knight, to Narvaez, the Christian knight says, "Well, by the rules of knighthood or whatever, you are my prisoner, but I will let you go for 3 days on the circumstance that you come back to me in 3 days, and you are my prisoner again. But I'm going to let you go, see the love of your life, and do this noble errand." Which again is a fairly conventional trope of knightly literature, where they say, "Okay, you got things to do, go do them, and I trust you to come back to me." And of course, a knight is supposed to be good to his word, and so he will return at the end of the appointed time. In some stories, it goes on for years. They set a date, say, "Okay, on your word of honor, you will return here, and you will be my prisoner." At which point, in many stories, the implication is, "And then we will kill you." So you can see that, it is a point of great respect for the notion of a word of honor, that anybody would hold to that agreement. But, of course, the Moor is going to. Now, the story that the Moor tells of his lady love is also his own story of woe, his own family, about how he was his family is very well known, great renown, very prominent, as great heroes, as great knights. And through some basically they were framed, they were set up and accused of treason, and thus banished, and all of their progeny banished, theoretically. And that notion of treason is important, because what we're talking about, what treason is, dual loyalty or conflicted loyalty. And, well, that's what Jews and Muslims were accused of. When they could not be counted on to be loyal subjects of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, they were questioned for that and decided, well, they all have to go. So it's a very clear parallel between that situation and the situation of the Abencerraje, where uh, through no fault of their own, through in fact trumped up charges against them, uh, they're accused of not being loyal to the Spanish way. And everything bad happens to him from there. And he is sent to go be raised with this other nobleman who has a daughter, and they're raised as brother and sister. And it is only as they get older that he starts to have doubts about this brother-sister thing, because he's starting to have feelings for it. And that sets up a dynamic also of, he has great feelings for this woman whom he sort of thinks is his sister, but he cannot repress his feelings. So there you have this dynamic between the sense of, I can't act on my feelings because of the social prescriptions against it, and yet my feelings themselves will not change. And the feelings the author knows, or the reader knows, are in fact legitimate. He's allowed to be in love with her. This is not his sister, and he should, go for it. It's a setup between society and the individual, and where is true honor, and what needs to be respected above the others in those conflicts where they crop up all the time between the needs of the heart and the needs of society. Where does that fault line fall? Which is your greater obligation? They figure out that they're not brother and sister. They have a nice little scene where they admit it, and it's lovely. And then they're dropping classical references because it's a knight in shining armor tale, great myths. But one thing there's one little scene that is quite interesting. He says, if fortune allowed us to live together, what a life I could lead. Okay, so, it's very romantic. Sweet little scene here. Saying this, I stood up and gathered some of the jasmine that surrounded the fountain, threading it with myrtle to make it a beautiful garland. Placing it on my head, I turned to her, both crowned and vanquished. She looked at me, more sweetly than it seemed than usual, took the garland from me, and placed it on her head. At that moment, she seemed to me more beautiful than Venus when she was judged for the apple. They were garlands, essentially little crowns of leaves, of vines, which has a couple resonances. They are talking about it after bouncing around some classical mythological stories, so automatically you can think of them as, well, that's to wear a garland, specifically laurel, is a sign of poetry, of art, and they are, in a way, certain artists. They are artists of love at this point. But more specifically, the fact that they do it to one another is a wedding. The rules of marriage, change with culture and time, but when you exchange garlands, that is, in many cultures, considered a wedding. The wedding ring is a holdover of that, of sorts, and that is what they're doing here. They never say it's a wedding, but that's what it is. They're in this Arcadian little grove. It's somewhat reminiscent of the wedding of Dido and Aeneas. It's a wedding. It's just not necessarily called that. And, well, they go about it, and they're worried about her father, who's going to object, and all fairly conventional love story, whatever. But they go about their lives, and then at one point they decided they actually get married. And they say, after summoning the lady in waiting, they spoke their marriage vows. So they didn't just get married, they spoke their marriage vows. Now being married, blah, 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 blah. And this is just sort of an afterthought. But it strikes me that, when you're reading, okay, well, they took the trouble right there. And there, the only difference, it seems to me, is, well, they didn't have the garlands. Maybe they did, who knows. But they had a lady in waiting there. I don't know how official that sounds. Maybe a witness, all right. But they spoke the words. The words make it different. And here you have something where the actual marriage was a couple of scenes earlier, and it was unspoken. It was just the acts of two people in love showing their emotions, acting on their emotions. And here you have them speaking the words to make it official. Well, why the contrast? Why the two things? What's the difference between these? The first one is prettier. The first one sounds neater. I would rather be at the first one, quite honestly, just to see them standing in front of the lady in waiting and to speak the vows. And we're not even offered the vows. They don't even give us the words. We're just supposed to say, oh, okay, it's just more words. Maybe they're beautiful words. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're just, I promise to come home at 6 o'clock and demand dinner and be grumpy because I'm tired from a day at work. We're not given any of that. So we just have to take it that, well, there were just words there. There's nothing more. Nothing particularly notable about them. Well, are words better than actions? Are words more important than what somebody feels? How does that reflect on the other issues that this piece is dealing with? Well, when the Jews and the Muslims were expelled, they did that as an act of law. Laws are generally made of words. Law, culture, society, in many respects, is a function of language. And when the language is in conflict with basic affairs of the heart, with humanity itself, with the yearning of two people who love one another to be together, when the law is different than that, which do you abide by? Which do you follow? And that second marriage drives home this point that the law is almost superfluous. Like this wedding ceremony, they were already married. Why do it again? It's pointless. It gets in the way, if anything else, because the story of Narvaez and the Abencerraje is a story of two people who are essentially equals. It is their little love story, in a sense, of them meeting and coming together and striking up a connection, a bond based on humanity. They have knightly characteristics that they have in common, and they respect one another, and they admire one another, and they try, doing all sorts of things, all sorts of actions to prove that they are, blood brothers of a sense, but they are irrefutably distinct in matters of religion. But does that matter? No. The story itself suggests that it doesn't matter. They are equals. And the world is better when they can get along, when they can be the best people that they can, egged on by one another. They meet and they fight and they reach the greatest versions of themselves in terms of valor and honor by competing with one another. And when the world loses that, when the world says, okay, the Moors, no, they are not honorable. They are not valorous. They are not knights. The world loses that spur. And that's a loss. That is painful. That is stupid, because that just leaves the Christian half of society, probably more than half, but without that little sense of distinction, sure, but living up to the best ideals, the spur to live up to the best versions of themselves. When that's gone, what's left to do but evolve? That's what this story does. It's a very short story, but it makes its point. And it does it in these courtly terms, these familiar, comfortable tropes of courtly love and knights in shining armor. And from a retrospective perspective, from a retrospect, says we can't abide, or we shouldn't abide, by these laws that just ruin something special. Let's make Spain great again. Let's take the culture of humanity, of civilization, of cosmopolitanism, of learning to overcome our differences and find what is good in one another. Let's take that and make that the true gold in the golden age.